This story is about a guy who grew up in a rundown little town in the south where dreams faded under the weight of poverty. He loved books and wanted to become a writer, but life forced him to drop out of school early and start working to support his family. Hi everyone, welcome to Life Unveiled. Let's get started. By the age of 28, Andrew had become a shadow of the boy who once dreamed of grand stories while sitting in the attic with a tattered book in his hands. He fixed cars in an auto shop where the smell of gasoline and oil soaked not just his clothes but his very skin. And at night he loaded boxes in a supermarket where humming fluorescent lights illuminated endless rows of shelves stacked with canned goods and cereal. His days blurred into a grey streak of waking up at 5 in the morning, followed by working until late evening, then catching a short sleep on a sagging mattress that creaked with every move, only to start over again with the same relentless rhythm. His father John spent his days on the porch of their old house with peeling paint, clutching a bottle of whiskey in a grip that seemed permanent, while his mother Sarah sat by the window with her knitting, staring blankly at the dusty road that stretched beyond their yard. Andrew was their only support, providing the money that kept the leaky roof over their heads and food on the table. The hands that once turned the pages of adventure novels filled with pirates and explorers had grown rough from wrenches and heavy boxes, calloused and scarred, and his soul seemed to have fallen asleep beneath a thick layer of exhaustion that he couldn't shake off no matter how hard he tried. One sweltering August day, when the air shimmered with heat and the sun turned the asphalt into a blazing skillet that burned through his sneakers, Andrew was walking home from the shop after a long shift. Sweat stung his eyes, soaking his brow. His shirt clung to his back like a second skin, and a couple of crumpled dollars sat in his pocket, meant for a cold soda to ease the dryness in his throat. As he passed the abandoned park where the grass had yellowed from the heat and rusty swings creaked in the hot breeze that carried dust, he noticed an old woman sitting on a cracked wooden bench weathered by years of neglect. Her clothes were faded, patched together with uneven stitches. Her hair tangled like a bird's nest, matted from wind and time, and beside her lay a worn-out backpack with a pattern that might once have been flowers, now dulled to a faint whisper of colour. She looked lost. Her posture slumped, and Andrew nearly kept walking, because his feet ached after 10 hours of standing, and his mind was fixed on collapsing onto the couch with a sigh of relief. But he stopped mid-stride and glanced back, noticing that in her hands was a book open to the middle, and she was moving her lips as if reading aloud, oblivious to the heat and dust swirling around her fragile frame. He took a few steps toward her, his boots scuffing the dry ground, and asked, "Need any help?" The woman looked up, her eyes clear despite the deep wrinkles etched into her face, the colour of faded blue sky washed out by years of sun, and answered, "I'm just reading, son. But I think I forgot where my house is." Her name was Margaret. She was over 70, and she admitted with a small, embarrassed smile that in the heat her memory sometimes failed her, leaving her confused amid familiar streets she'd walked for decades. Andrew could have shrugged and walked away, leaving her to figure it out because he was tired and hot and his own problems felt heavy enough. But something in her voice, soft and slightly trembling like a leaf in the wind, made him stay despite his weariness. He sat beside her on the bench, which creaked under his weight, listening to her rambling tale about the book, an old detective story about a sleuth solving cases in foggy London filled with twists and shadowy figures, and offered to walk her home, hoping it wasn't too far. Margaret paused, rubbed her temple as if trying to recall the layout of her own life, and gave an address 10 blocks away on a street he vaguely knew. Andrew wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, sighed quietly, but nodded and led her, holding her arm gently, feeling her frail hand quiver with weakness as they started the journey together. The walk took nearly an hour under the relentless sun. The heat pressed down like a heavy blanket, sweat trickled down his temples, stinging his eyes, and the asphalt melted under the soles of his worn sneakers, sticking slightly with each step. But Margaret talked non-stop, her voice a constant hum jumping from one topic to another without pause. She spoke of her son, who'd moved to another state for work and hadn't called in years, leaving her wondering if he was even alive, of her husband, who'd died of a heart attack 20 years ago, collapsing in their kitchen one quiet evening, and of the books that saved her from loneliness in an empty house where silence was her only companion. Andrew stayed silent, walking beside her, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust, but her words seeped into him like a cool breeze into a stifling room, cracking the shell of indifference that had built up over the years, layer by layer. When they reached her home, a small place with peeling paint on the walls and a crooked porch overgrown with weeds that poked through the cracks, Margaret stopped, turned to him, and thanked him, her eyes shining with gratitude that caught the fading sunlight. She suddenly handed him the book she'd been clutching its cover, worn and edges frayed, saying, "Take it, you'll like it, you've got a kind heart." Andrew started to refuse, mumbling that he didn't read anymore, his voice low and uncertain, but he took it, stuffed it into his jeans pocket where it pressed against his thigh, and headed home, feeling exhaustion mingle with something new. He couldn't name a flicker of warmth in his chest. The next day at the shop, things were slow, with hardly any orders coming in, and the mechanics lounged by the entrance smoking lazily, their laughter echoing faintly. Andrew pulled the book from his pocket, brushed off the dust that had settled on its cover, and started reading. Right there, perched on an old chair, amid nuts tires and the stench of oil that hung thick in the air. The story of the detective who pressed on through rain and betrayal hooked him like a fish on a line, pulling him into its world of mystery. He didn't notice the lunch break slip by or the sun shift across the grimy window, casting long shadows. And for the first time in years, he felt that old spark flare up, the one that burned in childhood, when he'd craft his own tales sitting in the attic with a notebook and pencil, surrounded by cobwebs and old boxes. The pages came alive in his mind as he read. He saw misty streets, heard the detective's footsteps echoing on cobblestones, and it was like a sip of water after a long drought, refreshing something deep inside him. A week later, he spotted Margaret in the park again. She was on the same bench, her frail form hunched slightly this time with a different book. Its spine cracked from use, and Andrew, instead of passing by, turned toward her and sat down the bench, groaning under their combined weight. They got to talking, their voices soft against the hum of cicadas, and he surprised himself by admitting that he'd once wanted to write stories like the ones she read, filled with adventure and heart. Margaret smiled, her wrinkled face lighting up with a warmth that defied her age. "Then write, son. What's stopping you?" He shrugged, staring at his cracked hands rough from years of labour. "Time, money, and who'd care in a place like this?" But she leaned closer, her voice steady despite her frailty, and said softly but firmly, "Write just one page. Start small, and we'll see what happens next." Andrew bought a notebook for $1 at the corner store, its cover plain and cheap. And that night, after a shift at the supermarket where he hauled crates of canned goods, until midnight, his back aching, he sat at the rickety kitchen table, its surface scratched from years of use. His hands shook from fatigue. The words came out rough like rusty nails scraping against metal. But he wrote a story about an old mechanic who fixed not just cars, but people's lives, finding purpose in the quiet act of repair. It was the first thing he'd created in a decade since those attic days, and he was stunned at how easily the pen moved once he let it go, the ink flowing like a river unshackled. The next day, he showed it to Margaret in the park, meeting her under the shade of a gnarled oak, and she read it slowly, nodding thoughtfully, then looked at him over her glasses, her eyes sharp. "You've got talent, don't bury it, you hear?" Her words sank into his soul like a seed into dry soil and started to sprout, pushing through the cracks of his doubt. He began writing at night when John slept in the next room, snoring loudly after another bottle, his breath heavy with whiskey, and Sarah sat in the living room with knitting needles clicking rhythmically, watching an old medical drama on a TV with a cracked screen that flickered occasionally. At first they were short tales about folks from town, woven from the threads of their lives, a store clerk who dreamed of the sea and studied maps, every night tracing coastlines with a trembling finger, a kid who fixed neighbours' bikes for candy money, his small hands deft with a wrench, an old woman who sat by her window waiting for letters that never came, her eyes clouded with hope, long faded. Then he took a chance and sent one to the local paper, a weekly rag with a circulation of a couple of hundred sold mostly at the gas station. A month later, they called the voice on the line, surprised and slightly skeptical. "We're printing it, kid, and paying you $20. Andrew didn't believe it until he saw his name in the paper in tiny print under the title "The Old Man and His Keys," nestled between ads for used cars and farm equipment. He bought Margaret a coffee at a cheap diner on the corner, its windows streaked with grease, and handed her the paper. Watching her face light up, and she said, "I told you can do it, keep going, don't stop now." Writing became his anchor, keeping him from sinking into the abyss of despair that had threatened to swallow him whole. He quit the supermarket gig to free up his evenings, the weight of those late nights lifting slightly, and signed up for free online literature courses he found on the web, hunched over an ancient library computer, with a whirring fan that smelled faintly of burnt plastic. Learning was tough with grammar tangling in his head, like a knotted rope plots fraying like old thread, under strain and exhaustion from the shop, weighing on his shoulders like a heavy coat. But he didn't give up pressing forward with a quiet stubbornness. Sometimes he'd sit until 3 in the morning, pencil scratching until his fingers went numb, writing about what he saw around him: dusty roads stretching into nowhere, people clinging to life with weathered hands, himself lost in the heat and greyness of a town that seemed to forget its own name. After a year, he compiled a collection, 10 stories about ordinary people whose voices went unheard, each one a piece of his heart, and sent it to a small press in the next state, attaching a note scribbled on a scrap of paper: "I don't know if it's any good, but it's all I've got to give." The reply came after 3 agonizing months, just as he'd nearly lost hope, the envelope trembling in his hands. "We like your style, simple but alive. We'll publish it." The book, Whispers of Dusty Roads, came out in a run of 1,000 copies, with a cover showing a road stretching into the sunset, painted in soft oranges and purples. It wasn't a bestseller or stocked in big stores, but locals snapped it up in weeks, drawn to its quiet truth, and Andrew held it in hands, still faintly smelling of motor oil, staring at his name on the cover with a mix of disbelief and pride. By 35, he'd left the auto shop after over a decade there, the clang of tools and hiss of air compressors fading into memory. Writing didn't make him rich. The checks were small and sporadic, but it brought steady income from articles for newspapers and magazines, plus the occasional sale of a story to small literary collections printed on cheap paper. He moved into a little house closer to the town centre, where the roof didn't leak in the rain, and the windows looked out on people walking, chatting, laughing, not just trucks rumbling by with their engines groaning. Sarah could rest now, not counting every penny, her shoulders easing from years of tension. And John, after a sober talk over coffee with his son, quit drinking the bottle replaced by a mug, and sometimes read his stories grumbling, "Not bad, son, though it's a bit long for my taste." Margaret remained his first reader and friend, a constant in his shifting world. They met in the park weekly, as long as her health let her hobble out with a cane, her steps slow but determined, and she always brought a new book to discuss over tea from a thermos, poured into chipped mugs they shared under the oak. Life wasn't easy or carefree. The struggle lingered like a stubborn stain. Money was tight, barely stretching from one month to the next. Publishers often sent dry rejections that stung like slaps, and his back ached from hours at the desk, hunched over notebooks and a borrowed typewriter. But Andrew no longer felt empty, like he had drifting from shift to shift in a daze. He'd found a purpose that breathed in. Him gave him a voice that carried beyond the confines of his small world, and people who stood by him. Margaret, with her quiet, unyielding faith. Newspaper editor Michael, who started commissioning his articles with a gruff, "Keep 'em coming, kid." Even neighbour Linda, who bought his book and asked for a signature, her eyes bright with admiration. Sometimes he'd pull an old box of childhood novels from under the bed, tattered volumes of adventure filled with dog-eared pages, and think, "It all started with that bench in the park with that book she gave me that day in the heat." He knew he wasn't a famous writer gracing magazine covers, his name unknown beyond the county line, but he'd become a man who told the stories of his town, capturing their struggles and small triumphs, and that was enough to fill the void that had once consumed him. Inspired by Margaret's example, Andrew began helping others, giving back what she'd given him. He set up free writing sessions at the library for teens, gathering them around a wobbly table, teaching them to craft stories, share their thoughts, find strength within themselves, just as he had in those early uncertain days. One kid, Brad, showed him a tale about a father who'd left his family the words raw and jagged, and Andrew saw himself in him, lost but searching for something to hold on to. He helped Brad finish it, polish the rough edges, submit it to the school paper, and the boy came back with a smile. Andrew hadn't had at that age a grin that spoke of pride and possibility. It was another sign his path mattered, a ripple from that first step he'd taken years ago. Years passed slow and steady, and Margaret grew frail, her body betraying her spirit. One day she didn't show up at the park, the bench empty under the oak, and Andrew found her at home, lying in bed with a book resting on her chest, its pages yellowed and worn. She gave him a weak smile, her voice a whisper. "You've done more than you know, son." A week later, she was gone, the silence in her house final, but Andrew kept writing, dedicating his next collection to her, a tribute to the woman who'd seen him when he couldn't see himself. He never forgot how she'd pulled him from the shadows with a simple act of trust and vowed to help others as she'd helped him through words, through faith, through a small step that started it all, weaving a legacy of quiet strength.
If you enjoyed the story, drop a like and subscribe for more tales like this. Hit the bell, and we'll catch you in the next one.